In the shadowed gardens of forgotten lore, some figures bloom and wither in the same breath, leaving behind only the scent of mystery and the stain of tragedy. To me, Romina, Saint of the Bud, is one such phantom haunting the history of the Land of Shadow. I see her not as a boss, but as a silent testament to a story deliberately left untold, a whisper of what could have been. As mentioned by VatiVidya in his video, when I look at that church, despite its location in Rauh, everything about it tells me it was originally a Hornsent structure. The best piece of evidence for my theory is the spiraling pillar inside. The spiral is of sacred importance to the Hornsent, symbolizing their ascent towards divinity, a column they believe will one day reach the gods. It strikes me as profoundly significant that the Church of the Bud was not, in its inception, a sanctuary for Rot worship. The lore is explicit on this point. To me, it's no mere coincidence that this symbol of their divine journey culminates in a budding flower. That scarlet bud obviously has a deep connection to Rot, with its flowers perpetually on the precipice of unfurling. I find it a fittingly tragic symbol that this Hornsent spiral of ascent leads directly to the budding divinity of an outer god, the Scarlet Rot. In that scene, as her church burned, it was this bud that Romina clung to. You can even see her holding the pole blade of the bud, which is a scarlet glaive with a dangling, bud-like blade. Its description, I think, confirms this interpretation, but here, Romina discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful Scarlet Rot. Perhaps then, the buds might find somewhere to gain purchase once more within the scorched remains. My personal theory is that this pole blade had been an enshrined relic in the Hornsent church, perhaps kept out of reach until the fire brought the building down. It was then, I believe, in a moment similar to how the Blood Fiends discovered their own twisted deity as a result of their torment, that Romina made contact with Rot, and it began to change her. The scorpion, as I've speculated before when looking at the scorpion stinger, seems to be an aspect of Rot's divinity. So it makes sense that this is the form Romina took on. For me, the most interesting part of her lore actually comes from Romina's Purification, the unique skill of her weapon. It imbues the blade with Scarlet Rot butterflies before unleashing 2 large sweeping slashes, yet the description says, this was once considered a sacred act of purification. The idea of this being a sacred act of purification seems incredibly ironic, coming from a weapon that inflicts Scarlet Rot. But why would this act of spreading Rot be called purification? To me, it suggests a history where Rot was seen as something to be cleansed, an impurity that has always been resisted. We can look to other examples of this kind of suppression, like Gwyn's war against the dark in Dark Souls, or Marika's own suppression of death in Elden Ring. In the case of the Rot, it seems it was eventually sealed by the Blue Fairy and the Blind Swordsman. Later, its resurgence was also denied by Malenia and her flowing blade. Eventually, her scarlet butterflies were left without a master and were soothed by Romina, who reached out to them. She, too, had lost everything. Romina's remembrance tells us that she found the twisted divine element and wove it into the baleful Scarlet Rot. To be baleful is to harbor a harmful or destructive intent. The fact that Romina wove the Rot into this baleful form, in my opinion, could suggest that the Scarlet Rot was not so harmful here before. I should note that this description is significantly different in the Japanese text. So to be clear, I'm not claiming that Romina created the Scarlet Rot. Rather, I think she simply brought out the most ominous part of it in response to her world being burned down. In doing so, she was able to bring back the scarlet buds that once grew in this small church, even if they were now touched by blight. This is how Romina has emboldened and empowered the life that is native to Rauh. She cannot burn the sealing tree behind the church because she does not have Messmer's flame. However, she is likely content to be a heaven to those that have been abandoned, those who yearn to be accepted as they were long ago. This leads to a final, grim ecological note. The spider scorpions in the realm of Shadow are noted to have grown much larger in recent years, and I believe this is a direct result of Romina's rise to power at her church. It's a shocking transformation when you consider their smaller ancestors were once just a common ingredient in Hornsent stews. Now they are a reflection of her baleful influence. There was a time when these buds were not touched by the Scarlet Rot's blight, when they were the symbol of the small church deep in the ancient ruins of Rauh. This tells me the bud itself is an entirely separate concept. I recall the Oxford Dictionary defining a bud as the nascent stage of a leaf or flower, a compact promise of future growth. Knowing FromSoftware's penchant for literal metaphors, especially concerning the world's great trees, I am convinced this concept of a bud extends far beyond simple botany in Elden Ring's universe. I've seen this exact parallel in the base game, where the term bud transcends flora to describe the sprouting of horns and even people, as in the unforgettable line, "The girl, Millicent, she is a bud." This, to me, connects directly to the role of the world trees in the grand cycle of life. Therefore, I firmly believe the church was once entirely divorced from the influence of Scarlet Rot. When I examine its architecture, the conclusion seems inescapable. It is of Hornsent design. The reliefs, the brickwork, the fine details, they are all identical to what I've observed in Hornsent settlements from Belurat to Inner Ilim. From this, I can only infer that the bud was of such paramount importance to the Hornsent that they dedicated an entire church to its reverence. I've even spotted a torch design in the land of the tower that seems to depict a bud at the heart of a ship, further cementing its cultural significance for me. But what exactly is this bud, and why on earth did it mean so much to the Hornsent people? Frustratingly, I find no further direct explanations of the bud within the Hornsent ruins themselves. However, I believe the answer lies hidden in plain sight, within a culture back in the lands, between a society that pointedly rejects the Erdtree in favor of reviving ancient natural ways. I'm talking, of course, about the Ancestral Followers. The more I look, the more I'm convinced that the Ancestral Followers modeled much of their culture directly on Hornsent traditions. The most glaring similarity, in my opinion, is the intense focus on horns. They believe that the horns of a long-lived beast continue to bud like antlers, over and over again, until the beast one day becomes an ancestral spirit. For them, a tangled horn, formed from repeated sprouting, is an irrefutable symbol of primacy. To me, the link is undeniable, as if to hammer home the inspiration. The talismans used by the Ancestral Followers are quite literally lesser versions of those created by the Hornsent. Furthermore, it's clear to me that both cultures share a disdain for those without horns. The Hornsent possess a rigid hierarchy built around the ability to grow horns, and are known to be cruel to those who cannot. In a strikingly similar fashion, the Ancestral Followers wield weapons described as envoy's wings, made to reap the lives of beings which experience no sprouting. It's also fascinating to me that while one might assume horned creatures are sacred to both, the opposite is true. The deadliest of horned predators enjoy the sport of hunting and devouring other horned creatures, which is precisely how Ancestral Followers, who haven't sprouted their own buds, come to wear the horns of others. I see a direct line of belief here. The Hornsent use horns to invoke divinity, making it a cornerstone of their societal structure. The Ancestral Followers, in turn, believe horns grant the power of an ancestral spirit, offering a new cycle of life and death outside the Erdtree's dominion. Essentially, my interpretation is that horns act as a conduit for channeling the power of spirits. The description of tangled horns as a symbol of spirituality confirms this for me. This spiritual connection is something I see demonstrated time and again in both cultures. The Hornsent show it through their divine invocations, their tutelary deities, and their ability to summon spirits. The Ancestral Followers are described as being versed in distinctive spiritual arts, using bows that work best with dwelling arrows, which are thought to dwell with animal spirits, and their archery enlivens the arrow with spiritual essence. And of course, there's the awe-inspiring power of the ancestral spirits themselves, who command the life and death of the spirit animals around them, absorbing their essence to adopt new fighting styles. This deep spiritual focus, in my opinion, is why the ancestral followers chant for new buds to sprout not just from their flesh, but from their very souls. Their belief naturally extends beyond the physical into the spiritual realm. And if I ever had any doubt about the shared nature of plant buds and horn buds in this world, I only have to look closely at an ancestral spirit's body to see leaves growing directly from its horns. So, I conclude that buds, or horns, are intrinsically linked to the divination of spirits. They are the very medium through which spiritual power is unlocked. With this understanding, it makes perfect sense to me why the Hornsent would build their sacred church of the bud right there. It seems to me that if the ancestral followers emulated the Hornsent, then the Hornsent must have, in turn, taken their cues from the even more ancient civilization of Rauh. The ruins are teeming with Hornsent spirits, most of whom appear to be engaged in a massive archaeological and research effort. These Hornsent scholars, I've noted, made records of their spiritual findings from the ruins, discoveries, thought lost to antiquity. They recorded them in cookbooks and on stone tablets, many of which, I found, were later confiscated and locked away in the specimen storehouse after Messmer's fire knights defied orders and urged that the specimens be preserved. The history of the Rauh civilization is, in my view, completely steeped in the power of spirits and horns. We're told that, in an age long past, before this land was enshrouded in shadow, the vitality of the crucible flourished, with the Rauh ruins being the most potent remnant of that era. I see this vitality still lingering in the life that remains there. And exceedingly rare to find calculus, suffused with spirituality, can be found by hunting the horned beasts in the ruins. This, combined with a beast horn also, suffused with spirituality, can be used to craft a spirit stone, a lost art of the Rauh. The bond stones used to manipulate these spirit stones reveal a fascinating, almost callous belief this ancient people held. Bonds with the sprites were made to be broken. This is precisely why, in my mind, the Hornsent constructed their church adjacent to these potent ancient ruins. So, if she was so central to this spiritual place, why does her story feel so incomplete, so deliberately silenced, as if she were a traitor to her own people? For Romina to have been stationed at the Church of the Bud, I have to believe she was a figure of some importance within Hornsent society, even if her exact rank remains a mystery. My personal theory is that she was a high-ranking member of the church, someone with enough knowledge and station to commit the ultimate betrayal, aiding Messmer's crusade in the destruction of her own people. Something has always bothered me about the DLC's structure. There are only 3 mandatory bosses. There's Messmer, whose kindling is essential to burn the sealing tree blocking the path to Aner Ilim. Then there is promised consort Radon, the clear culmination of Miquella's entire quest for godhood. And then there's Romina. The other 2 are drenched in lore, with multiple cutscenes and constant references throughout the realm of Shadow. Romina, by stark contrast, has none of that, no cutscenes, no dialogue, with the only direct information coming from the gear crafted from her remembrance. I'm sure that at some point in development, Romina was intended to have a much larger role, but I think what FromSoftware ultimately did with her is incredibly deliberate. Making her a required boss fight when so many others are optional feels like a massive, flashing sign to me. I believe they are trying to tell us something crucial through this choice. So, let's review what I know about the Saint of the Bud. She was undeniably present during Messmer's crusade. We are told, once, in the crumbling, burning church, Romina held the bud in speechless silence. A scene I vividly recall from the story trailer, where you can even see her future weapon, the pole blade of the bud. It was only after the church was burned to the ground that Romina discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful Scarlet Rot. Beyond this, her story goes cold, not just before the crusade, but after as well. We're given hints that recent, giant scorpions are said to trace back to the Church of the Bud. At some point, Romina's physical form clearly underwent a grotesque evolution, fusing her with inhuman biology, until she possessed the wings of a butterfly, floral growths, and a body that tapers into a nightmarish combination of a scorpion and a centipede, with a wasp stinger hidden beneath. It makes me wonder if this is related to grafting, which could hint at a connection to the shamans and might even be the origin of her saint title, though I admit this is pure speculation on my part. Alternatively, I find it just as plausible that this is simply the raw power of the outer god of Rot manifesting through her, much like how Moog can sprout wings under the influence of the formless mother. The abandoned pests found a mother in her, but it seems to me she hasn't commanded them or spread any teachings. They just linger near her or in the valley below. There are other members of the Forager brood, tied to Moor, scattered throughout the realm, but they lack that distinct pinkish-red color of her followers. In fact, it seems Romina has never even left the site of the church that burned down around her. It's as if she is bound to that place, perhaps by a sense of duty, or, as I suspect, by an overwhelming sense of guilt. Let's return to that haunting image from the story trailer of Romina holding the bud in silence. I am certain this is her, not just because of the identical weapon, but because her musical theme plays during this exact segment. If she was part of the Hornsent Church, doesn't it strike you as bizarre how close Messmer's soldiers are to her? Why isn't she fleeing for her life? One could argue she'd simply given up, but her posture doesn't read as fear to me. The soldiers, in their calm, ruthless advance, seem completely uninterested in her. I don't for a second believe this is because they simply missed her. The purge of the Hornsent was notoriously thorough, and she is anything but hidden. The only scenario in which Messmer's forces might have overlooked her is if the church was an insignificant location they passed through quickly. But I know this wasn't some random spot. This was the Church of the Bud, a sacred place of worship for the Hornsent. It was almost certainly a primary target, a location they even returned to later to plant the sealing tree. And yet, somehow Romina and only Romina survives this massacre, not by hiding or running, but by simply kneeling inside the burning church in speechless silence. To my eyes, her posture is not one of defeat or surrender, but one of profound sorrow, remorse, and guilt. This suspicion of betrayal is, I believe, strongly reinforced by what happened next. The sealing tree, which obscures the tower in shadow and cannot be burned without Messmer's kindling, was placed to seal away Ener Ilim and its divine gate after the crusade, preventing anyone from following Marika's path to godhood. It is a structure of immense importance, and yet who do we find guarding it? Romina, of all people. Not a loyal tree sentinel, not a fire knight, but her right up to the present day. FromSoft made her a mandatory boss for a reason, and I think the message is that she is responsible for defending the sealing tree because she earned that post. A tree that was planted right next to her church, a church whose destruction she somehow survived despite her passivity. A place where she remained uncontested by Messmer's forces, despite its proximity to their critical sealing magic. My conclusion is this: I believe Romina betrayed the Hornsent during the crusade. I believe she survived among Messmer's soldiers because they were allies, not enemies. And I believe that as part of her bargain, she was charged with the solemn duty of defending the sealing tree for eternity. Now, before you dismiss this, consider that this lens of betrayal, regret, and the weight of her comrades' deaths doesn't just explain the strange gaps in her history. I think it perfectly explains how she discovered Rot and found a twisted kind of solace in it. But how could she, a saint of a people who seemingly rejected this power, come to embrace Rot so fully in the ashes of her home? It's famously known that in the devastating aftermath of the crusade, Romina discovered a new sense of purpose within the horrifying resplendence of Rot. The text says she discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful Scarlet Rot, hoping that the buds might find somewhere to gain purchase once more within the scorched remains. This is the cycle of decay and rebirth that defines Rot, an element of the outer gods that eats away at life like a vicious plague. Where the buds of her church once served the spiritual needs of the Hornsent, they were now repurposed in her hands to become a medium for the outer god of Rot. It always struck me as odd that the Church of the Bud, now so thoroughly infested with Rot, was once completely unrelated to it, especially since flowers and buds are so commonly associated with rot in the base game. How could this place seem to fit rot so perfectly, yet have it only be woven in coincidentally after the fact? Well, I believe there is a very specific reason Romina was able to find rot there. The description says she discovered a twisted divine element. To me, the word twisted is key. It implies a bending, a curling, a distortion, or a rotation around a fixed point. What this tells me is that Romina was looking at a divine element she was already familiar with, but from a new, distorted perspective, and through that new lens, she discovered rot. I've seen similar language used to describe the revelations of the blood fiends and the lamenters. The blood fiends peered upon the corpse of their ancestor, normally an act of sanctity, and saw in its shadow a twisted deity. A god they had never seen before, but one they discovered after the brutality of the crusade altered their perception of familiar rituals. The lamenters, too, were ostracized for reaching conclusions that felt foreign and unnatural to the Hornsent, symbolized by a stone mask, twisted into an expression of rapturous grief. I'm convinced Romina discovered rot in the very same place as her former beliefs. She just approached it with a mindset irrevocably altered by the betrayal of her people, just as the Hornsent had found their spirituality in the buds and horns of the Rauh civilization. So, too did Romina find rot lurking in the same ancient ruins. Within those ruins, I found a unique talisman, a discus made of verdigris, the corroded metal known for its heft. The description states that Verdigris is said to be the gift of an outer god. In our world, Verdigris is the bluish-green patina that forms on copper or brass through oxidation. It is, for all intents and purposes, the rust of those metals, a product of their rotting away. What I've truly loved about the DLC's lore is how it has finally shown me the more positive qualities of rot. Rot is often perceived as stagnation, since its antithesis is flowing water. But I now see this isn't the case at all. Rot is the cycle of decay and rebirth. It is life overflowing, a high-speed turnover. While its life pushed to an extreme, the realm of shadow has made it clear to me that the result isn't always destructive. As one item states, those who dwell within poison know rot all too well, the death that begets life that comes to all equally. That is to say, it is the cycle of rebirth put into practice. So, in my view, rot is not death or stagnation, but a vibrant, albeit gruesome, cycle of rebirth. It's certainly a crude cycle, and I don't think many would share the wisdom of its devotees. Though men might recognize the keen intellect of the pests evidenced by this spear's uncanny design, it will never be understood by them. But I can't deny that rot can produce powerful and even wonderful effects. The pickled delights of the forager brood are enhanced by the fermentation or rotting of their ingredients. Not to mention, the friendly demeanor of Moore and his brood is a world away from the hostile kindred of rot I encountered in the base game. Perhaps this connection to rot also explains the popularity of scorpion livers in Hornsent cuisine, delicacy known for its numbing toxins. This positive aspect of corrosion is best exemplified by Verdigris, which possesses enormously hefty yet supple strength thanks to its rusted nature. Verdigris and the pickled livers illustrate to me that rot can have a protective power, caring for both the living and the dead, as seen in the shield that will continue to protect its target even if its bearer should die. Even Verdigris magic seems to embody this protective nature, knocking enemies back without causing them significant harm. So, what is the truth of rot that the Hornsent missed? The secret that Romina uncovered in her grief and guilt? The Hornsent, it seems to me, never grasped the true potential of rot. They saw only suffering and stagnation, not the power or grotesque beauty within it. And because of this, they appear to have studied the Rauh civilization solely through the lens of the Crucible, focusing only on horns and spirituality. But the very same buds they venerated, I believe, could also be twisted to channel the divine power of rot. This is the revelation that I think finally dawned on Romina after she betrayed her civilization. She looked upon the same church, the same buds, and in them discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful Scarlet Rot, hoping that the buds might find somewhere to gain purchase once more, within the scorched remains. It is deeply curious to me that Rot was able to blossom from scorched remains, given that fire is its natural enemy. It makes me wonder if the Hornsent didn't just ignore the rot within Rauh culture, but actively opposed it. Romina's Ash of War, Purification, is found on her pole blade of the Bud, a weapon that predates both the Crusade and her weaving of Rot into the church. This skill, which lifts the user into the air for 2 large, sweeping slashes, was once considered a sacred act of purification. The word once strongly implies to me that this was a sacred rite during the time of Hornsent rule, before the Crusade. Purification is the removal of contaminants from something, which suggests to me there was some unwelcome influence periodically appearing in the church. The sweeping motion of the attack reminds me of pruning or mowing, as if clearing away unwanted buds. I am only speculating here, but what if Rot had a way of manifesting in the church even before Romina, and the clergy's sacred duty was to periodically cleanse the area of it? Whatever the case, it's clear to me that Romina inverted this sacred act. Where the place was once swept clean, she now imbues her bud blade with Scarlet Rot butterflies, before the attack, actively spreading the very contagion she was once meant to contain. I believe Rot resonated so deeply with Romina specifically because of her betrayal. Rot is the cycle of rebirth put into practice, and I think she found a profound, if twisted, meaning in embracing this outer god, in accepting that death is what begets new life. Perhaps it was a way to assuage the crushing guilt she felt for her people's massacre. Life sprouts from death as it does from birth. Such is the way of the living, says one description, and I feel this became her mantra. In the very culture the Hornsent revered, she found an answer that embraced death as a necessary part of its cycle, a belief that a high turnover of life can be a positive thing. I see this philosophy in action during her boss fight, where in her second phase she summons hordes of beautiful butterflies only to detonate them moments later in a chain explosion. In this, she draws from both sides of the Rauh culture, an appreciation for Rot, and the grim understanding that bonds are made to be broken. Romina, in my interpretation, extended kindness by welcoming the abandoned and unwanted, and she extended death just as freely, for it was only in death that she could deliver a final peace and the promise of a new beginning. Her poison flower blooms twice technique epitomizes this belief for me, as it shortens the suffering of the afflicted in exchange for a burst of much greater damage. I wonder if her very appearance today is a reflection of this duality of Rot of life and death. One part of her is a centipede, a creature I've seen associated with death elsewhere, most famously as the curse mark of death on Rani and Godwin. In Japanese culture, centipedes often represent decay and the impurities found within corpses. If the centipede is death, then does that make the scorpion a symbol of virility and life? In her fight, the centipede is the primary aggressor, delivering death, but it is the scorpion that delivers Rot directly, the overactive, teeming form of life. Perhaps this is how the region's native scorpions grew to such a giant size after she embraced Rot, and maybe it's even connected to how Starscourge Radon became so enormous. Thus, she stands eternal guard, a monument of Rot and regret. Romina is not merely a forgotten saint, she is, to my mind, the very embodiment of a fallen faith, a chilling parable of how even the most sacred duties can curdle into damnation. She sought to purify, but in her moment of ultimate weakness, she betrayed her purpose and found a new one in the beautiful, terrible cycle of decay. She is a festering wound in the history of the Hornsent, a grim gardener tending to blossoms of blight, forever bound to the site of her greatest sin, a silent queen reigning over a kingdom of sorrow and rebirth.